Okay, welcome back. We are continuing on our second day studying challenges that come up in analyzing big cognitive science data. Our next speaker joining us via teleconference from Stanford University is Mike Frank, who's going to talk to us about challenges that arise in studying big developmental data. Mike, take it away.
Okay, thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Okay, thank you guys so much for allowing me to present remotely. I'm very sorry that I can't be there with you guys. It seems like a really amazing program. So I'm just glad to be able to contribute to that. So maybe I should have titled my presentation a little less optimistically, and it should be called From Cognitive Modeling to Regression and Maybe Back Again. So let me try to give you a sense of that journey. So language learning is the topic of my research, and it's one of the key areas in cognitive science. As you probably know, language explodes onto the scene. So this is my daughter at 18 months. The longest thing she had said at that point was happy bee for happy birthday. A month later, she combined words for the first time. She said blue ball. 23 months, she observed that my mother-in-law's dog only ate dirt. She said spiked dog dirt. Which is true. And at 26 months, she was a teenager already. She said, "Dada, move own body. Mine need a little bit more space." So this change in pictures, you can see her hair is a little bit longer. She's maybe a couple pounds heavier. She's got a little bit more dirt on her face. But those are extremely minor physical changes in comparison to the just dramatic change in expressive ability that happened over this time period. So my research tries to understand the roots of this explosion of language and the roots of this ability that children have to break into the linguistic system. And I study mostly the acquisition of vocabulary, individual words, and the ways that they're mapped to concepts, first via reference in the child's environment often, then to conceptual generalizations. And in my dissertation work, I focused on cognitive modeling in the probabilistic models tradition. I developed a model of early word referent mapping that took a set of observed co-occurrences between words and objects and a lexicon and a set of guesses about what people had been talking about in those moments. And I think this area of computational cognitive science, or this little sub area, was by many accounts a success. That is, there were a number of different models that were developed right around the same time with different computational traditions that all provide coverage of the same basic phenomena using the same basic assumptions about the structure of the problem. So that in many ways is very exciting. So if you think about computational artifacts like models as not a black box, but a gray box, one that reveals some detail inside, you can think about this problem schematically as taking some input or input predictors, running them through a learning model, and then trying to make guesses about outcomes. And of course, the dogma of computational modeling then is that these models can instantiate scientific hypotheses about the learning process. And the comparison between models then can be informative about the relative value of different scientific hypotheses in explaining learning phenomena. The only trouble was in the paradigm I was just describing, the input predictors for my dissertation work was 20 minutes video, and the outcomes was a handful of binary experimental results. As I've continued working with these sorts of models and thinking about language acquisition, one thing has become clear to me, that theory building of this sort requires more data. Why am I so strongly convinced of this conviction? Well, over the past 9 years since I finished my dissertation, a number of other trends have happened in the empirical world that have convinced me for the need for more data. One experience that made a tremendous impression on me was my experience collaborating in a consortium that tried to evaluate some of the replicability of small-scale experiments in psychology. And many of you will be familiar with the outcomes of this project, which were quite disappointing. So by many measures, about a third of studies recovered an effect that was similar to the effect in a published study from a high-profile paper in psychology. Now, this is just the first experiment in what's become a burgeoning meta-science literature. So there's a lot more to be done in evaluating what the precise replicability rate is in a particular. But this initial demonstration was really a wake-up call for me that if we bend our theories around individual behavioral experiments, we may be overfitting to a noisy experimental record. In addition, some work that Tom Hardwick, a postdoc, recently a postdoc in my lab, carried out, convinced me of a prerequisite problem that also requires attention regarding the data that we were using for fitting models. So Tom is interested in what's known as computational reproducibility, the ability to recover the same numbers from the same data using the analyses proposed by authors. Now that sounds almost tautological, but it turns out that this kind of computational reproducibility is far away from what the current practices are in cognitive science. So in one study that Tom did, we sampled 35 articles at the journal Cognition that had uploaded in principle reusable data. That is data that were complete, had a code book and metadata about them, and we attempted to reproduce one paragraph from the results section of a single study, these 35 papers. Of those 35, 13 of these papers were reproducible from the data. That is, writing new code, we could get the same numbers that they reported in the paper. Of the other two, another handful, about another third, were reproducible with author assistance. That is, we reached out to the authors and got clarification on parts of their analytic specification that were not available in the article, or we got access to data that were not available in the article, like exclusions or metadata. But in fully another third of these papers, neither we nor the authors helping us could reproduce individual numbers in the manuscript. That is, something in the manuscript was different than what they had reported when we computed it from data, and neither they nor we could figure out what. For me, this was extremely worrisome. By one metric, 10% of these authors, 3 different author teams, expressed a need to publish an erratum on their paper based on this reproducibility exercise. So the suggestion here is that both from the perspective of replicability, of reproducibility, we need to be very careful in using small data sets and individual studies to build theories. So what's the answer? Well, one answer that I came to was to try to think about ways that we can aggregate much larger data sets with multiple different loci of administration, meaning multiple replications of the data collection exercise, and put those together into repositories that provide the tools necessary for analytic reproducibility. And the place I decided to start was a common outcome measure for child language called the MacArthur-Bates Communicative Development Inventory. So the CDI, as it's colloquially known, is a very simple instrument. It's a parent report of what words children say, or for the younger kids, say and understand, along with some other checklist items about gestures or grammar, so forth. So the CDI is surprisingly quite a reliable and valid instrument for measuring children's early language. It correlates well with naturalistic data that's been transcribed. It also correlates relevant measures, and it's extremely inexpensive to administer because you're asking parents just to do a questionnaire. In contrast, bringing kids to the lab, then maybe videotaping them and transcribing speech is extremely labor intensive and costly. Because of this low cost and relatively high reliability, the CDI has been adapted for a tremendous number of languages. Actually, at last count, there are more than 100 languages with some flavor of CDI adaptation. So that presents a real interesting opportunity for gathering data together to create larger data sets of children's outcomes. My collaborators and I took advantage of this opportunity by creating WordBank. WordBank is an open database of kids' vocabulary development. So we reached out to folks that had done large-scale CDI norming studies that had adapted for various different languages, and we asked them to contribute their data. Our contributors very generously allowed us to host their full open raw data on this website in a coherent framework that allows access via an API, as well as exploration on the web. So if you're interested in playing at wordbank.stanford.edu, take a look at the interactive visualizations we have. Now, much of the work that I've been doing in the past couple of years uses the word bank data set to make cross-linguistic generalizations about early language. And just because this is the bulk of my work right now, I want to share just a couple of those with you before I go on to using this for cognitive modeling. A couple things that have come out of our analysis of the word bank data. First, we find really surprising consistency in first words across languages. So the kinds of things that little babies want to talk about early on, social routines, the people around them, small objects and animals, really appear to be driven in part, at least, by babies' consistent interests across cultures and communities. On the other hand, the rate of vocabulary learning across children is extremely variable. That you can see that in any preschool classroom. And it turns out, I think somewhat surprisingly, that this variability itself is constant across cultures. So the degree of variation in the rate of vocabulary acquisition appears strikingly consistent across the cultures and languages. We replicated the finding that there's a noun bias in early language. So across languages, there's some degree of positive bias for nouns relative to other words. But excuse me, in contrast, we find that the bias for or against verbs in early language is actually driven by the linguistic content of the language. So there's substantial variability there, with some languages showing a negative verb bias and some languages showing a positive one. Finally, the growth of grammar and word combination, as I was showing you in Madeline's case, is extremely tightly coupled to vocabulary growth, such that the two mutually inform one another. When one goes up, the other goes up. If you're interested in these generalizations, I encourage you to take a look at our almost completed book, which is freely available online. The book summarizes a tremendous amount of work that I, as well as Mika Brzezinski, Virginia Marchman, and Dan Yurovsky have done in trying to systematize generalizations across the word bank corpus. Okay. But the real reason why a corpus of data, this set of outcome measures across languages, was because we were trying to create outcome measures to evaluate learning models. And so now what I want to turn to is trying to predict outcomes from word bank using learning models. So the first study I want to show you is the work of Mika Brzezinski, who's now a graduate student at MIT. We took advantage of a tradition that's grown up in language acquisition of trying to predict when words are learned. The idea here is to get beyond some of the confounding that happens when you try to predict how good individual children are at language. So that confounding is that you can use predictors like the amount of language they hear and their type of home, but there's always a genetic confound, because they are not only getting input from parents, they're also typically genetically related to those parents and so forth. So the pivot that's been made in the language acquisition literature in the last 10 years or so is to actually start looking at words instead of kids. And the idea here is you look at how hard a word like jump is, or how hard a word like, try to predict why one is easy and why one is hard. Is it because dog is short and jump has, one morphonium? Is it because dog is animate? Is it because dog is higher frequency, and so forth? So we take advantage of the word bank data to do this exercise in 10 different languages. And so now we have 10 languages worth of approximately 600 words. So we have a much larger outcome set with a much larger number of kids, maybe around 30 or 40,000 kids contributing to those estimates. So how do we model those estimates? Well, the old modeling approach for cognitive modeling that I used in my PhD work basically fit cognitive models and treated those cognitive models as subjects in experiments. So we would get independent runs of the data from those cognitive models and assess the correlation with the experimental data. Now, of course, there's a real overfitting risk in the case that the cognitive models have lots of parameters, so you'd have to use pre-parameters very sparingly and try to make the case that your correlation too inflated by the presence of these free parameters. Now, this kind of exercise sort of works if you're looking to create a qualitative match between the behavior of the cognitive model and some small set of experimental conditions. But it's not really clear that this is the right approach once you get a large data set that may have a variety of other signals involved in it beyond the particular ones that you're most interested in your model. For that reason, the relatively newer technique has been to move to cognitive data analysis. I'm just taking that label. I wouldn't. I'm not proposing that as the right label, but that's kind of one label that I use in my head for this particular approach. And the idea in this approach is to fit models that predict directly to the observed data. I think one really nice piece of work that proposes this approach is Tauber et al. 2017. They talk about moving to Bayesian data analysis using cognitive models as part of the analytic approach, but also instantiating linking hypotheses that link between the cognitive model and the data. This is an inspiring paper that suggests really nice approaches for dealing with this in experimental data analysis context. Fitting these models in even medium-sized data contexts is not optimal, though, in part because of the large number of parameters that need to be fit when you have thousands or tens of thousands of participants, thousands of words. So accounting for variability across these in a complex Bayesian data analysis model is at or beyond the state of the art in terms of fitting methods. So our compromise is to use regression modeling, but we use regression modeling as our linking hypothesis with cognitive predictors. This technique allows us to include arbitrary control variables. It allows us to fit random effects for subjects or for words. And it allows us to use the standard regression toolkit to assess the incremental validity of particular predictors, as well as to use the standard machine learning tools for model checking, cross-validation, and so forth. And so that's the approach we've been gradually developing in working with the word bank data as our outcomes. So what are the predictors that we use to predict the age of acquisition of individual words? So first, we have to map these across languages through translation equivalence. But we can use predictors like the number of phonemes in a word, so dog being shorter than jump. Meaning predictors like concreteness, valence and arousal, the degree of association with babies or babiness, which is a predictor that's been suggested in the literature. But then we'd like to use some kind of input-based predictors like the frequency of occurrence of a word. For that, we need corpora of child-directed speech. And so we went to the Child Language Data Exchange System, which is an inspirational open data resource that's been around for a long time for sharing transcripts of parent-child and experimenter-child interactions. Unfortunately, ChildThis, although it's an incredibly rich resource, doesn't provide programmatic and reproducible access to the data. You have to download all the data in some particular snapshot, write your own parsing scripts, and try to make sure that those are directly connected to your outcomes of interest. This has led in the past to a lot of reproducibility issues with ChildThis-based analyses. So in order to get around this, we decided to develop an API, an application programming interface for ChildThis. We call this ChildThisDB. This is the work of Stefan Milan, now a postdoc at MIT, and Alessandro Sanchez, who was a research assistant in my lab. They created an API to ChildThis, a set of consistent and tested parsing scripts, and a set of online visualizations. If you work with child language data, I encourage you to check this out as it really streamlines the process of working with corpora. Okay, so putting all these predictors of acquisition into the mix, now we can run our regression model and examine the coefficients both within and across languages for specific predictors. So what I'm showing here are the coefficient estimates from this set of big regression models predicting which words are easier or harder. And the coefficient weights then provide a proxy for how strong that predictor was for each language. Those are the dots. And then across languages, those are the bars. So first thing you can see is higher frequency words are easier. Longer words, that's number of phonemes, are harder to learn across languages. More concrete, those words that show up alone in a sentence are easier, presumably for segmentation reasons. those words that show up in longer sentences with longer mean length of utterance, those are harder. Words that are associated with babies are easier, and are used at the end of sentences, those are easier. And then valence and arousal didn't do as much as had been predicted in the literature. Okay, so these coefficients now quantify some of our predictive accuracy using the different predictors that have been in the literature. On the other hand, this is really a first pass predictive model. So this is basically a regression model. It's a baseline for future modeling work. But one thing that is nice is we can now look at the consistency of these predictors across languages. And this was something we had divergent predictions about. We were uncertain whether the same predictors would have the same relative strengths across languages, or whether they would differ from one another because these languages are, even at this kind of very high level, learned differently. And it turned out that the predictor sets were extremely well correlated with the chance baseline across languages, suggesting that there is actually quite a lot of consistency in the predictors of learning, even across these diverse data sources and diverse languages. So now I want to end just by showing you very briefly two ways that we've tried to go beyond this initial regression model to start putting in some more cognitive predictors and getting back to the promise of cognitive modeling, but with a larger outcome set. The first piece of work is by Abdella Fortassi, along with Yuan Bian. Abdella is now a new faculty member at the University of Marseille. So Abdella took some work by Thomas Hills and Linda Smith and their collaborators using lexical networks to try and predict acquisition. So a lexical network is a network structure connecting the words in a child's lexicon, with the edges in this graph derived from either semantic or phonological features. And in much of our work, what we use here for semantic features is actually word embeddings from word2vec or glove type systems. What Hills and Smith and their colleagues defined were different growth processes for these networks. So they pointed out that a child's lexical network could be growing via internally driven growth. That is, if you found a cluster, say this cluster around vehicles in the middle of the graph, maybe the most highly connected nodes in that cluster would be the ones that attracted new connections to them. So maybe truck is very highly connected here, and so new nodes would be nodes that connect to truck. So that would be a model of internally driven growth, where the rich get richer. Since we know so much about trucks, we use that to learn new words. And that's the mechanism of growth that's been proposed for many different kinds of network structures well beyond the vocabulary. It leads to small world structure networks and has been shown to be a process that's in place in many different kind of growth situations. In contrast, there's an externally driven growth model, which says that, hey, this network that the child has is actually a very small subset of what's actually out there in the full adult lexicon. The thing that the child's going to learn next is not what's connected to what they already know. It's the node that's most connected in the full adult lexicon. This would be externally driven growth. That is, you know a lot about trucks, but you also need to know a lot about food. And so if there's a really important food word you don't know, you're going to learn that next. So Hills et al. Had found some support for this externally driven growth model in the semantic domain. Abdella took the regression approach that Mika Brzezinski had developed on our data and used these cross-linguistic network predictors to generalize Hills's work. What he did was use both semantic and phonological networks to predict children's acquisition trajectories in WordBank across 10 languages. And he found, confirming Hills et al., that the semantic external growth network was the best predictor across 10 languages compared to the internal growth model. And the same was true for phonological networks. The external growth model was actually more predictive than the internal one. And further extending Hill's work, he showed that these two predict reliable, even controlling for word length and frequency, which hadn't been completely controlled in this original study. So again, here we have an example where we're trying to move beyond just a straight regression framework to try to put in some more interesting predictors that are really starting to get at cognitive hypotheses about learning. The last study I want to mention is a very new project led by Eva Portelance, who's a student in linguistics here. She's using now neural language models as predictors, so trying to get beyond the reliance on pure frequency and mean length of utterance to use an LSTM trained on childless data to predict age of acquisition. So she's using surprisal in that LSTM model, that is a relative unpredictability of individual words, to see if she can capture something about the syntactic structure or predictability structure of the language input that would help predict acquisition. And here we're actually doing maybe a better job of model comparison because we're really trying to get the predictive advantage. So this is the absolute deviation in a validation set. And what our results here show is that when we add average surprisal and average frequency and the whole set of other predictors from Berginski et al., we get better held out prediction for age of acquisition. So we're doing better in terms of predicting when individual words will be learned. And a good chunk of that predictive accuracy, more than you'd expect by chance, comes from being better able to predict when function words are learned, suggesting that the surprisal signal is helping us in capturing some of the syntactic complexity, maybe syntactic and semantic complexity associated with function word acquisition. So this is a very preliminary result, but it's exciting to me because it suggested that we could plug in some more sophisticated models as part of this predictive word prediction framework. Okay, so wrapping up, what I tried to show you was a framework for evaluating learning models where we take input predictors that are much richer than the kind of small annotated corpora that my work began with, run those through a range of learning models that instantiate our hypotheses, and try to then predict cross-linguistic outcomes that are robust across many children. Hopefully, what this framework does is gives you a sense of how these tools can be an invitation to develop new models. And what we're really hoping for is that this ecosystem becomes a productive one for the evaluation and development of a new generation of scientific theories for understanding language learning. Thanks very much.
Let's see if we can pull up a question. Shout.
I'm just interested in whether you can add phonological neighborhood density to the model, because it seems that children have an easier time assimilating words that sound similar to words they already know.
So the question is about phonological neighborhood density. Sorry if I was unclear. Those phonological networks that Abdullah was fitting actually are phonological neighborhoods. So that really, it's not exactly the neighborhood density predictor that Holly Storkel and collaborators have used, but it's very close. So the internal is what's the neighborhood in the child's lexicon that is densest, and the external growth model is what's the neighborhood in the adult lexicon that's closest, and it's the it's densest. And it's the external model that's the better predictor in Abdullah's study across the different languages to be evaluated.
Okay, let's thank Mike.